My name is Kimmo Rönkä. I work in Finnish Housing Fair, and we are now in Jätkäsaari, and we are presenting a new city living concept, and it's a concept which we introduce for a new city area. So this is a concept to present the new housing area to the people and to tell about to the audience, to the people, what kind of wonderful things there are in the city. And this is the first time, and it is now in Jätkäsaari, Helsinki, which is an area of 6,000 or 7,000 inhabitants, and many of them have been living there 5 years. So the city living exists. It's not only a plan. And during these 9 days, there are about 300 happenings in 40 places in Jätkäsaari, different places of Jätkäsaari. And now we are in Jätkäsaari paviljonki, and we have here two kinds of sessions. The first, we started with Jätkä Talks, which are sessions for discussions, and the second one is urban research goes to Jätkäsaari. And the idea of this is to present new urban research themes and to open the idea of city living. So today's title is Trends of the Street and the City. And we have here Spin Unit, who has from 4 different speakers. And shortly about Spin Unit, it has coalesced into an international network of academics and professionals by combining design, artistic, and technical practice. Born as an academic endeavour, it has built on the varied expertise on its members to find new and creative approaches to urban analytics and redefine the practices of urban design. And first, I like to introduce our first speaker, Panu Lehtovuori, who is a professor of planning theory at the Tampere University of Technology, School of Architecture. Lehtovuori's research interests focus on contemporary forms of public urban space, new urban design approaches, the resource efficiency of built environment, and the evolution of planning law. In Spin Unit, his role is to develop qualitative analysis of urban space and interpret results of research and analysis for the planning practitioners. So, Panu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Kimmo, and welcome to our session, Trends of the Street and the City. Other speakers are not visible in the camera, but there is Jesus Lopez Baeza from Alicante, Jacob Dibble from Helsinki at the moment, and Michiru Nagatsu from Helsinki as well. Good. I will give a brief introduction in a way, and then I think through the other presentations we can deepen and get different aspects of what Spin Unit is doing. As Kim mentioned, we are working as a network in quite many countries. Here in the picture you see our core team stretching from US to Europe, and then some of active partners at the moment in different European and US countries. Clearly, our aim is to link different fields, link universities, academic research, municipalities, the kind of public action on cities, architecture offices, private actors who design and build our environments, and the economic driver developers of course, not forgetting the actual users, people who are at the core of the whole process. I will say some words about broadly urbanization, what we mean by urbanization, what are the current trends of urban change in contemporary cities. And as I said, then we can deepen our understanding of what we actually can do as networked academics with different novel data and novel analysis tools to make cities and city planning better. We all know that urbanization is a megatrend. Cities are growing all over the world, and of course Finland is not an exception. We are now in Jätkäsaari, in the middle of the growing Helsinki, in a situation where bigger cities grow fastest. Small places may lose population, both economic activity and social innovation in the sense of new forms of life, new ideas, increasingly focus in big cities. And here in Finland, it's quite striking that last year more than half of new housing, new apartments were built in Helsinki region. It's quite sharp example of the trend that is also visible in this diagram, showing that biggest grow fastest. However, urbanization as a concept, it's in a way having dual meaning. It's both quantitative and qualitative process. It means the growth of cities, the expansion of urban areas, but it also has a qualitative dimension of cities and societies changing, becoming new. And there, Henri Lefebvre, a French sociologist and philosopher who has been quite important in my own work, long time ago already made the point that Western societies were moving from industrial to what he termed exactly urban societies. And that comment was coined about 50 years ago, so it's pretty long time ago. It was during the 1968 urban revolutions, oil crisis, and it was at the time. Now, much later, we are in a situation that we can start to understand what this urban society actually could be. We are able to find concrete examples of new urban forms of life, urban commons, sharing economy, and the very complex influence of digitalization, creating what we might call hybrid space. Those are some examples of this new urban world, new urban society. And as a group, we in Spin Unit, we are interested in using different new tools, new techniques, new approaches to learn about that, to learn about what's actually happening in the social life, social process of new cities, new types of public space, new types of actual urban situations. Still on general level, what is driving urbanization, what is driving the growth of cities and the social change in cities? It's quite useful to make a distinction between production of space, the spatial offer, and what then different actors, including individual people, actually do. What is the location choice of lifestyle of individuals? On the right side, you see some points on this production side. One quite important issue is that there is much more markedly a global or international investment in real estate. Decisions to build offices, shops, even housing is linked to international markets, international decisions, and there is international real estate business that is having influence also in Finland. We are not out of that. Secondly, city authorities, cities, they are part of the game, looking for investments, looking for jobs. So there is a shared interest in urban growth in public and private sector. And as a planner, I think it's also useful to realize that there are changing planning ideals. 50, 60 years ago were looking for green, for forest, and so forth. Now the ideals are much more urban. There is interest in urbanity, in density. And these concepts are some that we are in Spin Unit studying in quite intensive way. Regarding individuals, people, there are some factors that make people choose. Hard factors, economy, salaries, where to get job, can I get job also to my wife or husband. Soft factors, how places feel, is it vibrant, is it feeling good. Questions of accessibility, and also the image. Should I move to, of course, Copenhagen, is nice image, Helsinki, quite okay. How about, I don't know, Joensuu? I mean, there is this kind of complex set of reasons, elements people are thinking when they make choices. Out of that, we can find some kind of cycle of urbanization where these profit-seeking business dimensions, lifestyles, and actual built space that is resulting, we create a cycle that in many cases is enforcing itself. And we can also look at in a different sense analytically and say that there is level of actual built environment, roads, railroads, urban blocks, that level of urban space is changing quite slowly. It's pretty resistant in time. Then there is the level of functions, shopping, factories, and so forth, that is changing sometimes quite fast. Shops are dying, new places are emerging as foci of consumption or culture. And then there is the very quickly changing level of actual mobility, where people are, what they do, where. And in our work in Spin Unit, we wish to study exactly this dynamic, understand the complex relationships between these layers, in a way, of urban space that are changing in different speeds. Especially our interest is in this upper level of individual choices, new phenomena, and we are today presenting new data and new tools to learn about that, which is a bit harder to map than the physical built environment. Good. Looking at this rapid change, here some quick points. Why city centers, the traditional urban cores, are having difficulty in keeping their character, in keeping especially their kind of commercial and shopping element. There is a big debate which is prevalent in European countries, in the US, and maybe becoming bigger and bigger. Also in Helsinki, I think that's an interesting question. Helsinki is growing. There is a lot of new programs, new investment, new inhabitants, also in the urban core. But it's still not always easy to keep them really lively and multi-use urban space. And this is a question which we are working. I think we can provide some answers through our analysis. As mentioned, the combination of physical and digital, our bodily situatedness in a way, and then new agency produced by mobile internet, new tools, including even increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence elements and so forth. It is creating a new hybrid situation which requires new tools. We cannot use only old tools to understand the contemporary situation. We need to take seriously this hybridity. Sometimes it's called also the mediated space, which does affect on how people use space, what is happening where, what is valued and in which way, which places become popular and why, and so forth. We have very many examples of that. One maybe being the fact that some Indian movie star takes a trip to Lapland, puts something in Instagram, and suddenly Lapland is big tourist destination in India. So it's one easy example of this type of process. Good. In Spin Unit, our aim is to put knowledge in work, to activate knowledge with different actors, as already mentioned, city and state, public administration, architects, designers, developers. We are finding several issues from maybe more abstract to more concrete, change in social life, the question of marginal or emerging spaces, what's happening in waterfronts, in old industrial zones, for example, what kind of new paths we can find to this type of spaces. And then, for example, pedestrianization. Is it a solution or not? What are the kind of concrete choices city planning and urban policy should make case by case? To take some, let's say, quick points on Helsinki. Here is one very recent map produced by Damino Cerrone, who is in a way the coordinator of our team, and he's making a comparison of the physical space, physical density, something we can see in the classical morphological map, and then the digital view to the same space. In that case, a data set of Foursquare that we are using quite much. And clearly we can see that the patterns are not the same. You see something surprising with this new data, with new tools. And that is the central point of what we are calling urban metamorphology, revealing the invisible image of the city through new data sets, through social media, through combinations of classical accessibility analysis and new sources of data. And in that set of analyses, we started to divide our work in three. So we are interested in space, in the classical elements of morphology and accessibility. We do focus on activities, what is happening where, who is doing what, and then we try to understand values, what is valued, which are the tools to understand valuation, economic valuation, popularity, and so forth. These are the three sets, and I think those three sets will appear in these different presentations after me a few times. Good. Planners see different things than what people see and do. That may be a simple way to put it. And we can say that quite often at the moment, especially marginal is becoming socially and economically central. Löyly, here very close, is a very good example. In special terms, it's at the edge, but it became very, very important for Helsinki and was even listed as one of the 100 best places on earth by Time magazine. So it's really the social media visibility, the hybrid space is raising this spot to super, super high, surpassing Senate Square and surpassing the Stockholm City Hall, for example. So this tells a lot about the process. I'm basically stopping here. As I mentioned that in our work in Spin Unit, we have been doing analysis and consultancy in very different types of contexts. And just to open a little bit our mind from this little bit hot and in some sense quite urban Helsinki to the east, to Siberia, to the vast space of Russia. I briefly mentioned that about 2 years ago we did quite a big consultation about this type of cities, about Russian monotowns. Russia has 400 monotowns, about 20 million people live in those towns across whole Russia. It's the same population as whole Scandinavia. And Russian state is interested in improving the quality of life in those often forgotten, quite desolate, quite hard, small, and not always so small towns and cities across the big space of Russia. We did big analyses, collaborated with actors, analyzed in more detail about 80 of these cities and towns, tried to understand the quality of place, made comparisons between these different locations, and could produce also spatial understanding that is then directing urban design and urban planning choices case by case in these very varied, very different cities and towns in Siberia, at the deserts of Mongolia, close to Moscow, and so forth. This type of global view and interest in fresh research topics is our DNA. Good. I would stop here and give floor to either Jesus or Kimmo. Do you want to say something in between?
I think we could have a question if somebody wants to instant one question. Or we go on and then maybe have a short discussion lately. In the end, maybe all of us on the floor. So next our speaker is Jesus Lopez Paiza from the University of Alicante in Spain. And Jesus is a researcher in the Building Science and Urbanism Department at the University of Alicante, Spain. As a member of SPIN unit, he focuses on the study of urban phenomena using location-based social media data and GIS open data. Part of his work encompasses social cohesion, activities, and livability of urban spaces, and citizens' preferences in urban public spaces, among other dynamics. He combines his research with architectural design practice, specializing in advanced spatial analysis. So, Jesus, please, your floor is yours.
Well, hello. Thank you for the introduction. I am Jesus Lopez, and I'm going to talk about trends and hypes of Helsinki through the eyes of social media, which is basically a cool title to say that I'm going to talk about social media trends and big data to study the city from the urban planning perspective. So, yeah, as a background, I'm an architect. I'm doing my research in the University of Alicante in Spain. And, yeah, let's start. So, what are social media? We all know what social media is. We all tweet, post pictures on Instagram. We all use Facebook. But have we ever defined what are the parameters that make a network a social media by itself? So, one of the most important characteristics of social networks are listed here. The key point is that the users are the ones that are producing the content. So instead of a regular website where you go there online and you see something that is already there, here social media, the base of social media is that you see things that you have posted yourself or your friends have posted. And this leads us to the second point. The content is shared publicly. So users interact with each other using this content that is shared by themselves. So this is the concept of social media. Also, to say that each social network has a defined format. Twitter is text, Instagram are pictures, etc. And also from the anthropological point of view, this is quite important. Users decide to display the content. Users are aware that they are displaying this content and broadcasting them to the public, to the world. And why is it useful to use social media to study the city? Well, we have data that is available with a GPS trace on it. That means that when you post something, sometimes this post has a GPS trace. So this interaction online, this interaction that you make online, this action that you make online can be traced back to a place in the city. And we, as urban planners and researchers, can study the city from this socio-spatial, socio-digital perspective. So this is quite interesting. So can we use social media to make better cities? And what is the point in using social media to make better cities? So the thing is that we not only use social media, but also we can broaden up the definition of it, including all shared economies that are digital-based rather than place-based. We can include Airbnb, we can include Uber, etc. Everything that you can just book with your phone, basically. And this means that we can not only, as Panu said, have a look at the city from the spatial perspective of buildings and streets, but we can also have a look at this huge digital sphere that includes all of these interactions. So the point is that by using this data, we can have a much better understanding of how spaces function, how places function. This is why we place part of our work here in this intermediate step, where data is taken from the social media and from the websites, and it's analyzed and interpreted through the eyes of architects and urban plannings to orientate possible further interventions to make spaces better. This is the point of all this. We have to understand spaces better to be able to make them better. So what we do is that we try to update the traditional urban planning methods from the past century, from the 20th century, to all these new resources that we already have. As Panu said, the last century methodologies, for example, we can quote Jan Gehl or Jane Jacobs, etc. They were designed for a different temporal control context, where basically cars were causing major issues in the city center, and the aim of the planning was to have bigger green spaces, bigger pedestrian spaces, less cars, and in general higher life quality standards. But nowadays we have already dealt with these issues, so the point is not fighting the car anymore. And also these researchers were describing quite particular methods of how to go to these places to study them by hand with a notebook, count people one by one, trace people, and in this case, if we have to study the economic activity of one street front, the traditional method would be go there and map each of the shops one by one. Now we have access to all this information at the same time in one computer with one simple data set. So this is one of the biggest potentials of these kinds of analysis. So what to do with it? So this is one example. Here we calculated the diversity of economic activity in the city of London. We can link high diversity and high complexity. That means a lot of places and a lot of different places, a lot of restaurants, hotels, bars, in types of places and in amount of places at the same time. And this is linked to a probability to be economically successful. So this is one kind of study that we can do with all this data, one example. So as Panu said, we have moved from the traditional understanding of the city as form, structure, and function, streets and buildings, and that's it. Now we are in a liquid city that is in constant movement. We have the cities basically activity, interaction, and sharing constantly. So we are in a hybrid city, in a mediated city, where the physical space is just a small part of it. And we have the tools that are much more powerful that allow us to look at the entire city at the same time. And also the aim has changed, the method has changed. So the entire thing needs to be rethought and redesigned and adapted to the current century. And this is one of the key questions that we always get. Can we trust data? Is data trustful? Because we always get the same question. Nobody uses Twitter. Nobody uses social media. Well, here we run a correlation analysis between amount of places found in the social network Foursquare and the size of cities in terms of population in 160 cities in Europe and Finland. And the hypothesis was to compare have this correlation between population and amount of places in Foursquare. It is known that the amount of venues in a city, it's already correlated with the population. For example, one city with 1 million inhabitants may have 5 hospitals. One city with 2 million inhabitants might have 7 hospitals. It's not proportional. And when we plotted these data from the social network Foursquare, we found the same correlation, 90% correlation. So we do trust data. to do these kinds of studies. So the entire point is that we are shifting towards a new area where this social media is playing a major role in our everyday activity patterns. We make decisions using social media, where to go, what to eat, who to talk to. And new disciplines have emerged from this process, not only in urbanism, but also digital anthropology tries to understand the new cultural expressions and social norms that emerge in social media. For example, what are the motives that drive people to post a picture on Instagram, or what do they mean with it? Also in sociology, we have new social hierarchies and new emerging roles of people like the influencers on Instagram. Who are they? What do they want? What's their game? And again, in urban planning, the potential are the digital traces that we can trace back this interaction online to a place in the city, and therefore study the city in this dimension. That wouldn't be possible in any other way. So, how can we study, for example, activity patterns using the social network Foursquare? So here what we did was to adapt the traditional methodology of Jan Gehl in the study of activities. He was a Danish urban planner that for the first time was studying the link between design of places and public life, about space and what people do in those spaces, this link between two of them. And he establishes this classification of activities in these two big groups, optional and necessary, that is so elemental that it can be extrapolated to any other scale. So even though he was only focusing on small, public, open, and pedestrian spaces, we can scale it up to all kinds of activities in the city. Basically, do you have to perform that activity or not? Is it necessary that you perform that or not? For example, an optional activity would be going to the cinema, going to a bar, going to socialize. A necessary activity would be going to work, taking a bus, etc. So we can scale up all this classification to the entire spectrum of activities that can be performed in the city. As we see here in this graph, what we did was to divide these two big groups into 10 subgroups that were particular enough to be operative and broad enough to cover this entire spectrum of activities. And to do so, we based ourselves in previous research in those fields in the latest century. So basically what we did was to transfer this categorization that was based on previous research to the categorization of places in the social network Foursquare. Foursquare has over 800 different categories of space, 800 different types of places, for example, Chinese restaurant, Italian restaurant, etc. It has 860 actually. And we reclassified these spatial categories into our 10 subgroups and two big groups. So this is the city of Helsinki with this computation. As a result, we got what we see here, the geographical distribution of all places in the city according to these two big groups, and the quantitative distribution of venues and categories. And we were also able to perform complex mathematical indexes like the complexity index, gravity index, diversity index, etc. Here, as we see, red is optional, green is necessary. This will be constant in the following slides. And more specifically for the case of Helsinki, we see that one of the particularities that Helsinki has is that optional and necessary are more or less balanced. We see 44% necessary, 56% optional. We'll see further that this is not constant, but one particularity of Helsinki is this one. And also the most relevant category here is leisure. And if we have a closer look at the different spatial categories, we see that in the general ranking, as we saw before, here the first category is a shopping mall. However, the first place in terms of visits is the Helsinki airport, followed by the Helsinki Central Railway Station. So here, places are ranked by the amount of visits that they receive in the app Foursquare. That means that if you go to IKEA, you check in with your phone, so that visit is registered in the database. If we have a look at the other two columns, food and consumption, there is a particular tendency here. We see that big brands are growing and big chains are expanding. If we have a look at consumption, for example, we see that almost 100% of the category department store is led by Stockmann. and almost 100% of furniture store is led by IKEA. So these big brands are getting bigger, and they are covering practically the entire market. One particularity would be the exception clothing store right there at the bottom in red. 50% of the market is led by H&M and Zara, and the other 60% is led by smaller shops. This is one particularity. So the point is that maybe the space of the city is not changing that fast, but the activities that we found in them are changing actually. But in this case, they are decreasing the diversity. So this is the same calculation performed in several other cities in the Baltic region. And again, the proportion between necessary and optional activities is more or less similar. Helsinki is the one that is, actually is the second one that is most balanced. And we see also patterns of distribution in the points, spatial distribution. The city center is always really diverse, really merged. However, we found these hotspots of one single activity in the peripheries. This is one of the examples, the city of Turku. It is mapped by different categories, and also what we found here, as Panu said before, is that the spatial accessibility and the spatial centrality is not always linked to the activeness and to the liveliness of the places. So we always find the city center, it is a hotspot, but we also find some hotspots that are in the periphery. So this would be centers of activity, centers of people interacting and doing stuff that are not highly accessible and highly central. So this is what we are seeing, this is the attachment between the space and actually the activities and what people do. Here is an analysis performed with Twitter using tracking. Basically, when one person tweets in Helsinki and then he or she tweets in Turku, there's a line linking the two same tweets. So when we plot the nearby Baltic region, what we found is the frequency and the strength of the connections between different cities. And again, here we find one of the strongest connections between Helsinki and Tallinn and Helsinki and Stockholm. Also, the second strongest connection would be Stockholm with Tallinn. But what we see here is that St. Petersburg, despite its size, is actually the biggest one, is quite isolated. So the connections of St. Petersburg within the rest of the major cities is quite weak. It's blocked. No. Okay. Also, we can use Instagram pictures to help us see how spaces are perceived and used by observing how spaces are represented by the users of Instagram. So, well, it is true that during the 20th century, the photography was based on the representation that what was standing out, like birthday parties, weddings, traveling with your family. Nowadays, in the 21st century, we see that the photography is representing everyday reality and consumption sequences constantly. So we can analyze much more things, having a look at pictures than before. So this is one of the analyses performed by one of our students in one of our metamorphology workshops. And basically, he was describing the most symbolic and representational elements of the space by overlapping these Instagram pictures and see what specific spots were representing the most. And also, this is another project, Baltigram. Here, three major Baltic cities were represented by pictures on Instagram. They were divided in pictures taken inside the old town, in social housing district and suburbs. And what we found out here was that the way of the presenting and the spaces of representation were changing between the different areas. For example, in the suburbs, most of the pictures were taken outdoors with trees. We see green there. However, in the social housing districts, what we found are selfies taken indoors. So we can infer that the quality of the public space and the outdoor space in social housing districts is not as high as the one in the suburbs. And in the old town, we find this mixity of both, this high diversity of spaces of representation and a high diversity of activities being represented. So a way of having a look at this is having a look at the dominance of the colors in the pictures of Instagram by plotting this kind of different graphs. The warmest colors, the yellow and red colors, are pictures taken indoors. Green and blue colors are pictures taken outdoors because of the trees and the sky. And the bottom there and the upper part in the left one are the nightlife pictures with the dominance of the purple and dark colors. So we can see different activity patterns and different spaces of representation only by having a look at the dominance of the colors in the pictures in this big scale. And also the identification of the content by the content of the pictures, the dominance of the content, can lead us to read the city in a different way. Sorry. This is another work performed by one of our students in one of our workshops, and they were trying to characterize the different mobility hubs in the city of Helsinki, trying to understand if the importance of the spot by itself was the transportation qualities, or there were social hubs. They were places where people were meeting. And they did that by qualifying the pictures of Instagram if they were portraying live objects or simply buildings. And they also make a correspondence analysis with activities in Foursquare. So they get to define different nodes and the identity of different transportation nodes only by having a look at this kind of data. And again here, another one of our students in one of the workshops performed was trying to see the correspondence between the pictures portraying people having drinks and actually the density of bars in the city of Helsinki. And they found that the correspondence are not matching. And actually, going deeper into the pictures of people drinking, they found that the people drinking in outdoor spaces, the density was different than the people drinking at bars and people drinking at home. We see that people drinking at home is found mostly in the periphery, where there are not bars actually. And again, using Instagram, we can have a look at and how active different neighborhoods are throughout a year, or throughout a week, or throughout one same day. And here what remains constant in the different neighborhoods is the Helsinki Design Week, which is a peak, Christmas, Vappu, and Midsummer holidays. Also, we can see the different particularities of the different neighborhoods and where's the peak of each one. So yeah, I made it to 20 minutes. So yeah, basically the point is, the idea that you have to, for you to take away is that we can understand how places function better by having a look at the data that we cannot see with the naked eye. And also we can have this perspective of combining these new tools and new resources with traditional research techniques to face actual and future problems in our cities to make them better. That's all.
Thank you, Jesus. So we also, from your, we have an article in the internet, and it was introduced by our editor, and so you can find some information and about your research work in Finnish. Also in you can find it from the web. Okay, let's go further. The next presentation is called "How Philosophers Can Improve." Okay, you switch. Okay, good. Okay, next one. So the next one is. The title is "From the Sanctuary to the High Street: Why Street Fronts Matter." And the presentation is the person who presents is Jacob Leonard Dibble. And Jacob is an urban designer with background in mathematics, who has worked as an urban design consultant across the variety of planning, design and mobility projects in the UK, Italy, Russia and Finland. His practice 1 equal 2. Is it okay? Okay. Yes. Urban design is a specialist consultancy implementing studies of urban morphometrics, network analysis, and scientific spatial analysis into contemporary planning and design. 1 equal 2 urban design has recently partnered with Spin Unit Lab to integrate their respective approaches of urban morphometrics and urban metamorphology into a methodology of urban metamorphometrics to understand, wow, how the urban form and its spatial networks generate activities and values. Now you have to explain more about this, so please, floor is yours.
Thanks. Good job. How do I put it into presentation? Down. This one. Good. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Jacob Dibble. I'm going to talk a little bit about urban morphometrics, which is the theory and approach that forms the background of my own practice, and then I'm going to talk about the Street Fronts project, which is a collaboration between myself and Spin Unit Lab. So I'll start. These are a few images from different parts of Helsinki. And when we look at them, I think it's quite clear that they're all different. I mean, we can see that. We can see that they have a different character. We can intuitively understand that they serve different purposes, different functions are used in different ways. But the question is, why do we know that? How can we see that? All of these places have the same components of the city. We see buildings, we see blocks, we see streets, we see open spaces, uncovered spaces, built spaces. But actually, it's the arrangement of all of these elements that make us understand that they have a different character, that give these places a different function. And it's important to understand this. But why? I mean, this question of why do we study the urban form? There was a famous academic who spent 15 years going into every single building in the city of Venice in Italy, so he could understand the age of the walls and the doors and the roofs and the buildings and create maps of how the city changed in time. Why is it worth this level of effort to understand our environment and the character of the urban form? One answer to that question is we need to understand how this form allows certain functions to appear in the city. And more importantly, we need to understand how those functions perform. So what's the relationship between the urban form and the design, the character of the city, and how the city is actually working, how well it performs? Most importantly, we need to use this information to inform future design. If we can understand how our cities have grown and changed in the past, both for the good and for the bad, we can inform future design. However, the way we understand our cities in this sense, in this discipline of urban morphology, is generally based on qualitative evidence, on subjective opinions, on discussions. And there's a lot of value in this, but we also lose information. So what urban morphometrics does is it provides a more systematic and quantitative way of understanding what the city is, of assessing this character that we saw in those images of Helsinki. How can we understand that character not through discussion but through numbers and through quantitative analysis? So to actually design this approach and implement it, there were 4 major stages. The first was defining the scale. So at what level do we actually look at the city? We also want to unify the definition so that when we look at the city, we're all seeing the same thing. We need to develop a method so that we can actually measure these characteristics that we talked about and that are so evident to see. And we need to validate this process to make sure that there is some substantiation behind what we're saying. So this image is kind of a hypothetical images of a sanctuary area. For simplicity, it's a neighborhood. It's the area that's generally bounded by urban main streets. Sanctuary areas are present in all cities across all time, and they cover the entirety of the city, or the town, or the village even. And what's interesting when we look at the city at this scale is that there's enough information in the sanctuary area to see changes in patterns and to see large-scale patterns. However, it's a small enough unit that we can actually identify the local character. In this top image, this is an example of a small town in Wales, in the UK, called Caernarfon. And what we can actually see is that the sanctuary area is defined and surrounded by these medieval walls that have been standing there for hundreds of years, literally forming a sanctuary. So that's where this idea comes from. At the bottom, I don't know how clear it is to read, but we can see examples from Kaupunkitutkimus here in Helsinki, Algeria, and Berlin. These sanctuary areas are present in all cities, but it's the actual structures that we see in them that give them their character, that allow a certain form allow a certain function to occur. So inside this neighborhood, what do we have? Buildings, like we said before, buildings, streets, open spaces. But as an example, this is central Helsinki. We can see very clearly the blocks, either through a professional opinion or a common understanding of how the city works. The blocks are the areas surrounded by the streets. But just down the road in Helsinki, we have this neighborhood. Where are the blocks here? We need a unified understanding so that we can all see the city through the same, I suppose, set of eyes. And so at this point in morphometrics, it was about coming up with definitions so that we can assess what we see. What are these elements of the urban form? And the process developed 21 elements. We call them the constituent urban elements. Some of them were new, necessary to understand new aspects of the city and how the city works, but some of them were about unifying otherwise common understandings of what the block is or what the street. In fact, in 70 years of research in urban morphology, the field related to the study of the urban environment, there was no single definition of the street, neither presented nor discussed. So we have the neighborhood. We want to understand the neighborhood. We know what the components of the neighborhood are. But this character that we saw in those first images of Helsinki, that has to do with the sizes and the shapes of these components and the arrangement and the relationship between them. So to assess this relationship numerically, we need to create measurements. So in the morphometrics process, 207 measurements were developed. These are measurements that are statistically different, so they're not measuring the same aspect of the urban form. Why 207? Because this was an exhaustive list. It was originally 300 and it was cut back after we saw a few overlaps in these measurements. So we know that we want to look at the city at the scale of the neighborhood. We know what the neighborhood is. We can define the elements of the sanctuary area, and we know how to measure them. So what we want to know now is if these measurements are actually meaningful. So the object becomes comparing a statistical classification of the urban form with a classification based on historical evidence or evidence through other research. 50 sanctuary areas were chosen from 50 different cities around the world. And each of these neighborhoods belong to either a historic type of urban environment, an industrial urban environment, post-war new towns, or contemporary sprawl and suburbs. And we know that these neighborhoods belong to these different classifications predominantly through historical evidence. The New Towns movement in the UK, for example, is highly documented, and it's very easy to understand which cities were built at this time. So we have this classification, based on historical evidence. So now can we create the same classification based on the measurements, these 207 measurements of the city. One of the results of this process was obtained through a process of statistical hierarchical classification, the result of which is called a dendrogram, and that's this image here. This might look familiar from biological or evolutionary studies, and the way the dendrogram is read is that the tips of the branches represent these neighborhoods, and the closer together they're joined, the more similar they are. And they form larger and larger groups. But the more distant, the higher up these groups are joined, the more different they are. So what we actually see in this image is 4 very distinct groups that actually with 94 I think was a number, 94% accuracy reflect those groups that we know based on historical information. So in other words, we know through the measurements and the numbers at the scale of the neighborhood that there is relevant, precise, and accurate information held about the character of the cities that parallels what we know through historic or other accounts of the urban form. So what can we do with urban morphometrics? There are many applications, but one application can be in creating master plans. It's about taking information from what we see and implementing it through design. For example, if we can identify places that work well, that meet a certain purpose, that are valued, for whatever reason, we can identify the characteristics, the structural aspects that give them their character and implement that through design. This was one application of that approach where a group of students were given different data sets. And all they knew was that they had to create a master plan and follow the rules of these data sets. But what they didn't know is that the data sets actually reflected the characteristics of the historic cities, of the new towns, of the sprawl. When the designs were finished, they were measured and classified with all the other cities, and it was found that the designs they drew were the most accurate average representations of all the other cities. So in other words, through a simple numeric code, we were able to control with perfect precision the outcome that we were looking through design. But everything I've been talking about the city so far has been at the scale of the neighborhood. And there's many benefits to understanding the urban form at this level. We can see information relevant to evolutionary changes in the city, notions of sustainability, of adaptability, importantly also through, sorry, there's something popped up on the screen, some notions of connectivity and walkability. But what we lose by only looking at the neighborhood is we lose the interaction between the people and the urban form. We don't have any information about what we perceive when we're using the city. And when I say using the city, what does that mean? We walk, we ride our bike, we go to the store, we come in and out of our buildings, we sit on a bench, we see people. And there's a certain space that this is all actually happening at. And it's in one sense, it's the street, but it's not just the street. It's the area that is the street, that is the space, and that's defined by the city around us, by the architecture, by the characteristics that we can see. And this space is what we call the street front. And this is the subject of the collaboration between myself and Spin Unit, where we are trying to understand not just the shape and the character of these street fronts, but how that shape and that character can generate and sustain different types of activities and different values in those activities. And what we're doing is we're building up a database of street fronts around the world. And we're looking at, first and foremost, how we can define the morphometrical characteristics of the street front. Again, how we can measure what we see when we're on the street front. And we're comparing this and finding patterns and then relationships with activities and the values. So we're using the urban morphometrics approach and we're merging it with the urban metamorphology approach, which I think we're calling urban metamorphometrics, like that. So I'm not going to go into all the details of our findings. We're still developing this process. We're still obtaining these patterns. But I will just talk kind of generally, kind of briefly about how we're understanding the street front and how we're putting our ideas together. So this is Uudenmaan in the city center. It has a very high number of activities, a lot of venues, and these are obtained through the urban metamorphology approach. I have up here 5 examples of morphometrical measurements. We are working with 100 right now. So this is just a sample. We're not going to go into too much detail, but the idea is to look at the form of the city in this way and understand the values of activities. And before I go into more detail, I want to stop and say that, as we've heard in our other presentations, activities and values in the city don't always follow this hierarchy of spaces. This was an idea in urban design and urban planning, that activities always followed the same pattern of spaces and connectivity and the street network and how people can move. And maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe it was never true, but at the very least we can see that this pattern is changing. Especially in contemporary urban life, it's changing. So these 3 street fronts that I'm going to talk about, they all have almost identical spatial centrality values. In other words, their role in the local street network, their role in the local neighborhood, and their role in the entire city is actually equal. But we can see that the form is very different and the activities are very different. And this relationship is the topic of our collaboration and what we're exploring. So in the city center, we can see that we have a relatively consistent street front. The buildings are built more or less consistently along the street. The buildings and the parcels of land to which they belong all have similar widths. There's not much variation, nor is there variation in the height of the buildings. The density is distributed rather equally in correlation with the entrances to both the buildings and the shops. But now we look at Kolmas linja in Kallio, and we see nearly identical spatial patterns, meaning the street's actual importance in the local network and the Helsinki city network is equal. But we have next to no activities and very few venues. So why is that happening? We argue that this is happening in response to a particular environment. So when we look at the actual street, when we look at the character of this street, it is a bit different than the city center. We can see that. But when we look deeper, there are certain patterns that are similar. For example, like on Uudenmaan, there's very little variation in the widths of the buildings or in the parcels of land that these buildings belong to. The street is dense, and this density doesn't change too much, although we might see more fluctuation. So these are all the characteristics that we perceive and that we see and that we're measuring in the morphometrics and metamorphology approach. So, of course, the whole city can't have the same level of activities and values and density of people as we would see in the city center. However, Kallio is a good neighborhood. It is busy, it is vibrant, it's valuable. So why do we see on the same spatial characteristics of a street very different values? Does it happen in response to a different type of built form? That's what we're trying to answer. And lastly, in Lauttasaari and Lauttasarentie, just one street west of the new metro stop, immediately we see a very different urban character. However, we see here more activities than in Kallio. This urban character is different. The density is distributed differently. The buildings are set back. They're oriented towards the street much differently. The entrances are not anymore from the street, but rather from the parking lots or from a path in some cases. But again, when we look deeper, we start to see an overlap in the structure. For example, the width of the building plots, the land parcels, here in Lauttasaari is almost identical as in Kallio. And there's just as little variation between these widths as in Kallio. So the point of this, without going into too much detail, without discussing more conclusions, is that this pattern of built form of the street front is not so simple to understand. And it requires a little bit more complex type of analysis, especially if we want to find this relationship between form and function, this age-old question in urban design and planning. What's the relationship between form and function? And together, 1 equals 2, spin unit, we are defining this form in more detail. We're defining the function through activities and values, and we're putting them together to understand more how the street front works, turning this into relevant design and planning guidance, and putting a focus on the street, on the part of the city that we use, that we experience, and essentially where the city is meeting the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. I would really like to see Jätkäsaari in your, what kind of figures would we have in Jätkäsaari? Oh, really? Great. So we will talk later, but the next presentation is called How Philosophers Can Improve Urban Design. And the person who is going to speak is Mirichu Nagachu. He's an associate professor from Institute of Sustainability, Science and Practical Philosophy at the University of Helsinki. Michiru's areas of expertise includes behavior economics, philosophy of emotions, and methodology of interdisciplinary research. He is interested in improving walkability and livability of Helsinki areas through urban design drawings on these fields. With background in behavior economics, Michiru works as a behavioral intelligence unit inside SPIN unit. So please. Here you are.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm Michiru. I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about the relationship between the city and the people. And the title is a bit kind of ambitious. How can philosophers improve urban design? We have to first maybe convince people that actually philosophers can improve urban design. I'm quite positive about this, but maybe just to relate to the previous talks of our SPIN members, I think the focus will be mostly normative, and there's in Jacob's presentation there was a scarce quote around good city, but maybe philosophers are bold enough to talk about what is a good city, like straight, and that kind of talk. So what are philosophers' comparative advantages? Philosophers are good at something maybe, and here the idea is the comparative advantage. So comparative advantage means that even if we are bad at everything relative to other people, maybe we are, maybe there's something that we can do, while other scientists and researchers are doing more important things. So for example, relatively speaking, we are free in terms of scientific disciplines. So we can think freely from disciplines, look at different disciplines, make some connections that scientists don't usually make. So that's one thing we could do. And also we can ask unexpected, strange questions, such as, is the city an extended part of our minds and bodies? And finally, we could give complicated and useless answers. It depends, what do you mean by the mind, and blah, blah, blah. So that's what usually philosophers do, or what people think that philosophers do. But I want to, try something different. So my goals in this presentation is first to give a simple and useful answer to this question, namely, is the city an extended part of our minds and bodies? And encourage you who are here and watching it through the internet encourage you guys to think about the relation between the city and its residents in a slightly different way than the traditional approach. And then finally suggest some design principles for what I call urban nudges, and give a different meaning to this popular term, nudging. So let's get started. In philosophy, in particular philosophy of mind, there's the so-called the standard model of the mind. And this is not only standard in philosophy, but it's standard in many other disciplines, including psychology and economics. So the idea is that the mind is kind of isolated. So we have our own minds, and mostly located inside the skull. And then we get some stimuli from the outside, which occurs in the environment, and then we give some responses. And that's how all psychological experiments have been designed, and there has been different schools. Some people are less interested inside the mind, other people are more interested in what's inside the mind. But the basic idea is the mind is there, and you do something to it, and then you get some response. So this was a very simple kind of metaphysics of the mind, as it were. But so in recent years, there has been an increasing trend to challenge this kind of standard picture of what the mind is and how it's located. And this is the so-called extended mind thesis. So already 20 years ago, Clark and Chalmers made this claim that the mind is extended to the external environment. And their kind of motivating example was Otto and his notebook. So in this case, Otto is someone who has some problems with short-term memories, but he uses a notebook and a pen in order to aid his daily activities. And in this case, what the brain does to ordinary people is performed by the notebook. And they claim that in this case, we could say that Otto's notebook is part of his mind. So in this way, they kind of made a nice connection to the functions of the brain as mind and what's around it. And the idea is that it's probably misguided and misleading to think about the function of our mind just focusing on what's inside the brain. And what's more important is to see how this brain or mind is located in the natural environment. So that was a sort of groundbreaking idea in philosophy of mind. And we are living in this kind of post-Clark and Chalmers era, at least philosophers. And so there has been a lot of modifications and elaborations on this simple idea called the extended mind. And often the mind is called, it's distributed, and it's situated, and it's scaffolded. So there's a lot of different ways of talking about this idea. But a simple point is that how we think, feel, and behave is constrained and at the same time enabled by various artifacts and importantly other people and cultural meanings that we inherited from the previous generations. So this way we can think about mind in less individual focused way and more focused on the situations and settings. So to compare this with this picture, you can think about the mind as kind of spreading and scattered across the environment. So that's the philosophical bit. And then there's this idea called the niche construction, which is borrowed from evolutionary biology and ecology. So the idea is that we form the environment, and the environment forms us, and there is some kind of feedback loop between these two sides. And somehow we create this niche, ecological niche, where our functioning and affordances are defined by the environment. But we can also change that environment in order to change us. So that's the sort of ideas used in a more metaphorical way than in the real evolutionary biology. But you can see pictures like this. So, for example, in this dam, you can see the beaver changing the ecological setup, and it affects their evolutionary trajectory. And the same way, I think it's a pine forest making fire, because it's very flammable, they burn themselves, and then create a kind of soil environment which is good for their species. So there's this kind of thing going on in the nature. And also in our society, we can, in this urban environment, we can think about making this kind of visual representation of the city changes our perceptions and also changes what we do with the city. So it kind of affects how we perceive, affects how we behave. So in this way, you can think about the niche construction in an urban context. So that's a simple idea. And this sort of idea was intuitively grasped by the previous generations also. So this is a quotation from the so-called Chicago School sociologist, Robert E. Park. He says, the city is not, in other words, merely a physical mechanism and an artificial construction. It is involved in the vital processes of the people who compose it. So already some 90 years ago, the sociologists were seeing the relationship between the city and the people in this kind of more organic and ecological way. And I'd like to promote this way of looking at it. But what's the kind of benefit of seeing our relation to the city this way? So what exactly do we get from this kind of exercise? I think it's useful because it guides us to think about, so what is a good city? What does a good city look like? You know, what do we want from the city? And it kind of organizes this, our normative inquiry, so to speak, into the good city. So the good city this is just my proposal. It's not the final word, but I think it nicely captures what we really intuitively need or want from the city, a good city. So the good city is one that we can trust, for example. It should expand a sense of agency and control. So we feel good when we are in charge of something, and we can perform certain actions according to our own wish. So for example, if you want to move from the university to Jätkäsaari, how fast can we do this? Is there any frustration in between? And I think the public transportation and also applications and those things will help you to perform this task. And then when the city is organized in such a way that a certain activity such as commuting is facilitated, then you feel you can trust the city. You can do more things in the space. So that's one way of thinking about the importance of transportation systems. And secondly, a good city is the one that we can individualize, because by definition, cities are made of people with different needs and moods. So the city has to have different areas and niches where people can achieve different kind of goals and emotional states. And that's a quite important point, and I think it has some implications for how to design the city centers and the districts. So that's one thing. And also you can find a specific space in the city where you can feel most comfortable. So that sort of idea of niche, finding your niche in the city is particularly relevant in a city with a certain size. For example, Helsinki is quite big. It's not like village. So you have to have a certain level of comfort and feeling good in this way that, oh, this is my neighborhood. This kind of feeling is quite relevant to when you think about the design. So can Jätkäsaari create this sort of feeling? It's an interesting question. And finally, although individualization is important, it doesn't mean that it's a kind of slippery slope to privatization, because the important function of the city is to enable sharing, and in particular sharing of emotions. So here's Mikko Salmela, who's sitting there. He's my collaborator on this philosophy of emotions, and we discuss this idea of sharing emotions in the urban environment. And that's one very important function that tends to be forgotten when you look at just the city and what the city can do. I mean, the city can do many things, but oftentimes it's together with other people. So it's a really important point. So the sharing enables emotional sharing and identity building. So that's a crucial part of our good city. So that's very simple ideas. And before closing, I'd like to mention, so how can we do this? So I want to talk about this popular notion, nudge. So it has been proposed exactly 10 years ago by one legal scholar and behavior economist. So here you can see this Cass Sunstein talking to the last president. And Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize in economics last year for his achievements in behavior economics and also the idea of nudge, behavioral public policy. And they call themselves choice architects. And it's a kind of interesting metaphor. They say that they are kind of architects, and they build these certain choice environments where people can make a right kind of choice. So that's very suggestive metaphor. I'd like to hijack it. But one difference I'm thinking about this nudging in the urban context is that we don't really know what is the rational choice, because this research comes from behavior economics, where people spend decades studying people's irrationality. So that now they know that people are irrational, people make stupid mistakes, and the idea is let's change the environment so that people make the right choice, the rational choice. But in this urban environment, we really don't know this kind of clear-cut standard. What is a rational behavior in the urban context? So we have to think more broadly. We have to think about what is a good life in the city, what do we want to achieve, and what kind of environment will, afford such activities or way of living. So I'm not promoting that by way of making urban nudges, we can improve individual decisions, but we are improving urban niches as a whole. So one worry about this idea of changing the environment in a subtle way to make people behave differently is that it sounds very scary. It sounds almost like a subliminal advertisement. You don't notice what you're doing, but you are behaving differently, and it sounds like you are manipulating people's behavior. And this kind of worry has been raised by many philosophers and some economists, in particular libertarian people. But our idea of this urban niches is kind of more robust, and because we are not talking about the individual in isolation, we are not talking about the mind and in the vacuum, because we are thinking about fundamentally different picture of how individuals are located in the urban environment. So it's not necessarily the case that once we change the environment, people change the behavior, therefore we are manipulating their mind. So of course we are manipulating the mind because the mind is extended to surroundings. So we change people's behavior by changing the environment, but that doesn't mean that we are operating behind their back. So it's not against individual liberty and autonomy. And on the contrary, I think a good city, for example, I talked about the trust. So the good city should enhance our sense of autonomy, right? So if you are able to move from A to B in a reliable way, in a reasonable time, then you have more autonomy because you can control your life. So this way you can think about urban nudges slightly differently, and therefore make this proposal more appealing to people who are worried about this manipulation. So that was one practical benefit of thinking about the mind as extended to the environment. And I hope this made some sense. There was no concrete suggestions, but So for example, this one is just putting the piano on the stairs, and then people start taking steps rather than elevators. And this kind of small things, people respond. And probably not the best example of urban nudges, but now we are trying to think about exactly what kind of urban nudges will enhance our agency and autonomy in this contemporary urban settings. So thank you. I will end with that.
So thank you. I definitely have to watch this from Asuntomessut TV to see what all happened, because it was so fascinating. I would like to ask you, as a city designers or planners, quite simple question. In a city, what is changing and what is not changing in the future? Could you try to describe what is not changing in the city? If Panu, you could start.
I think somehow our collaboration is partly based on this idea that somehow the stone, the physical city, is changing, as we can see around here, but it's still changing relatively slowly. But then what people do, what they think, what they value, how they build their niches, that may be changing even quite fast. So we are seeing a qualitative change of our urban society, and people are making new choices, sharing stuff, living together, having different social composition, different values, different ways to earn their living, even though the physical setting is not changing that much. And then this dynamic is, I think, the crucial thing, because still the physical setting, as I think what Michiru said, it also does have a meaning in that. But I think that may be a starting point.
Yes, this urban niches and urban nudges. So could you, what do you suggest to city planners in Jätkäsaari? What kind of things should we design here?
Yeah, I was just talking with Jacob about this because all the examples of this urban nudges are in a way a bit trivial, right? So in order to prevent homeless people from sleeping on a bench, you just put needles, or like making a bar so that you can lie on a bench. And these are kind of discussed examples, but we are thinking about something slightly more broad and bigger. Do you have any ideas? I can't really come up with what Jätkäsaari.
Maybe I can just bridge a little bit. So I think one quite important. You discussed emotions, and then we discussed uses, the links between built and activity, but some kind of better understanding of how places feel. I think that's quite important. How to make Jätkäsaari feel good. And that is very, very important question. It's about atmospheres, it's about emotions, it's about some kind of imago even. There are many words for it, but we all know that there are these historic places. Why we go to Venice, and it's but how to make something like that in new environments, not in this kind of cheesy way, but still in a way that makes a difference.
Can I say one more thing? So related to this emotion topic, I think this sharing emotion is important because, you know, once you share the sentiments, certain sentiments, and you know that other people are feeling the same way, somehow you start to feel good. That's what Adam Smith said. And from this respect, I think making this, let's say, you know, how do we differentiate suffering from traffic jam and the suffering from bad public transport? I think both are bad, but you cannot really share the sentiments with other drivers when you are sitting behind the wheel alone, right? So there's no correspondence of sentiments. While if you're in a bad traffic And maybe it doesn't happen, but sometimes when you get the announcement that, okay, now the train to Amsterdam is delayed, and then you just sigh and then look around and you see other disappointed people, and somehow you feel relieved. You start to talk, oh, what a disappointment. And then some conversation might start. So I think it's really important that space is organized in such a way that this kind of basic human emotional sharing is enabled.
I can say one example that one community actually in this Jätkäsaari area, they have a wonderful society, our community there. The people know their neighbors. What was the secret? The first day when they moved to the apartment, the elevator it wasn't working. So they had to help each other, and that was the nudge to know neighbors. So we maybe how to organize positive nudge. And I have one example that food and invest in kitchens, in common kitchens, because food is the shortest route to the clients or the inhabitants' hearts goes through the stomach. Okay. What do you think of these? How to make positive accidents in the city?
Maybe I'll try to answer that a little bit. Like Michiro and I were talking about, these nudges. The first thing that he said was how to prevent people from sleeping on a bench, for example, is with the spikes or the needles or the railings. But I don't have an exact answer, but how can we implement these nudges in a good way at a larger scale? How can we kind of push people to use the city in a certain way? And again, on a large scale, talking about Jätkäsaari as a neighborhood. I live here, I'm used to it. It's a very designed neighborhood. It was not grown organically. And I think that we can see that, for example, in the connectivity between the streets. And that, to me, is this sort of example of this nudge, where we have a very clear hierarchical structure of the streets, from the local street to the kind of secondary street to the primary street, and you can see it through the architecture, through the character of the street, through the width of the street, something that easy. And to no surprise, the majority of the shops and the supermarkets are on Välimerenkatu here, which is clearly the main street through many different reasons. But I kind of interpret that as a nudge through higher level urban design. And I think at least as a resident here, it's working. How it changes in the future and how it's going to pan out, we're yet to see. But
yes, maybe just a continuation to what Jacob said. If we discuss Jätkäsaari or some other new area or evolving area, I would definitely think that to give more space for people's own agency, that's definitely something we should focus, not to design, not to define everything, because we know from our research that there are so different wishes and there are so different practices, but often they're a bit hidden or difficult and so forth, and to give a bit more actual expression to this actual complexity of human life.
I would like to ask what this kind of event, because 300 different happenings in this area, how does it see in Twitter, for example?
Well, we can study that, yeah. We can have a look at the hashtag or have a look at the name and see how many people are here tweeting, or how people move after this event and where do they go in the city. After that, we can follow them on Twitter. Yeah, of course. Studying events and the impacts of the events in the city is one of the potentials of social media, of both Twitter and Instagram, because with the hashtag, it's really, really traceable. The events are really traceable.
But what kind of, this is a 5-year-old city district, and this is maybe the first event that it's all over the neighborhood. Should these kind of events be one of these nudges that maybe improve knowing neighbors, maybe improve knowing the neighborhoods? What do you think?
No, definitely. I think community identity building is a very important part of this process, and you can really see some people, for example, Capula, they are really proud of. I mean, maybe they're proud because they paid a lot, but there's a sudden kind of feeling that they belong to this community and that they together make this place better. So I think this kind of event might be a starting point for Jätkäsaari as well.
Yes, well, we just had a summer school and we discussed place making, place shaping, and letting be. And obviously in a new place like this, we are in the middle of place making. Somebody designed the streets and decided, okay, this is wide and this is narrow. There has been a very big process and investment in making a new context. And right now and over the coming years, of course, there is more and more focus in place shaping, doing something with existing people and existing opportunities, evolving a little bit. But I will still also stress this letting be. It's important that not everything is made and shaped by somebody, but there is possibility for anyone, even the non-human agents, as was mentioned by Michiru, to put some mark.
So the concept name of this event was Living Parts. What are the living parts in Jätkäsaari? That was before me, but the idea was that we would like to see what kind of things the community itself is presenting, and most of those happenings are presented by the inhabitants. So this event, this session is I would say top down, or how to say it's, and we are a platform for university to present these ideas. But anyway, is there any questions? Mikko, could you come here so we could see your in a TV? This is a live studio.
Okay. Yeah, thanks guys, very interesting presentations. I'm Mikko Salmela from the University of Helsinki. I've been collaborating with Michiru Nagatsu for several years on topics of sharing emotions, in which kind of ways in we can share emotions and how they act, how they influence this kind of communality building. And I was thinking about these presentations from the perspective of interdisciplinarity, because I'm also studying interdisciplinarity. And in one slide, Jesus, you had this picture where there was urban studies and sociology and anthropology. And I was thinking how these digital studies could contribute to the areas of sociology and anthropology that look into social norms and social identities and social roles. And then it came to my mind when Michiru was discussing these kind of nudges and emotional sharing, that maybe there might be a way of putting these together such that digital data might reveal us areas in which people share emotions. You can look at these kind of pictures, posts from the perspective of emotional sharing. And you could then kind of try to put that data together. What kind of environments would be those in which people really kind of share emotions to this environmental urban planning to make these environments kind of more conducive to these goals of good city, allowing this individualization and sharing. What do you say?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah. Is it? Okay. No?
Use this one.
Yeah. Okay. One of the potential of having this huge amount of data is pattern identification, so we can identify patterns of emotions. For example, if we read the content of the tweet, so if we read the face expressions of people in pictures, for example. So this is one of the potential. However, one of the limitations is that most of the emotions that are shared online are positive. So you can measure a gradient of love or happiness, but it's really difficult to measure negative emotions. But yeah, it's one of the potentials. So.
That's interesting. No. I think sharing of positive emotions is the most important one if we want to design these welfare-conducive environments. I mean, of course, we can learn a lot of these shared negative emotions as well, but that's perhaps because there are these bad examples that we should then avoid.
Okay, but anyway, please use this because come here. This is and introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Neha and doing my PhD in Aalto University in the media department, but I'm basically an architect. And my question is to Jesus. When we are using social media as a tool and collecting data at such a large level and then comparing it to these huge different cities in the different countries which are quite culturally specific, then the whole analysis is done on these generic markers and then coming out with a generic sort of analysis. Don't we lose the specificity of a city and then the whole matter of catering to the locale, which would give us a richer urbanism in the end, because your work is quite comprehensive. It covers, you presented quite intensive analysis of this comparison, but then I was concerned with when we talk about place, it's very specific and it can't be generic at all. Then are we not losing this specificity if we use the tool like that?
Well, it depends on what you are looking for in your analysis, because you can also play with the scale of the analysis. You can have a look at several cities at the same time, just one city or just one neighborhood or just one square or one plaza. One of the analysis was taken, it was not presented here, but it was taken just in one street that was 200 meters long. So in the potentials of playing with the data is that you can select the area of the city that you want to study and you want to analyze. So if you are having a look at the entire city patterns, yes, you lose these small specific things because of the scale. But you can also zoom in and see them if you want. It always depends on the aim and the objective of the type of analysis that you are doing. It depends on every case.
Yeah, but the markers, they are also very generic, like the activity.
The activity patterns, okay, yeah, those were based also in previous researches, but the point is that it's really difficult to establish a categorization of everything that you can do in the city, in every city in the world. So the point of these markers is to cover the entire spectrum, but to be specific. So this is the duality that was kind of difficult at the beginning. But I think, no, I cannot play it. But we can somehow accomplish that. I think that this classification, yes, it loses maybe some activities that are in between two categories, but you always have to make a decision. And also, the base was the classification that was previously performed by the application Foursquare. So this is also a kind of filter that it was already implemented and validated by them at the beginning. So,
okay, thank you. And guys, thank you for this great moment with you. And next time when you need companies or other organizations, please ask Housing Fair to be involved. We'd really like to be involved in this kind of network. Thank you all, and last time, let's have a upload to the guys.
Yeah, thanks for the organizers on behalf of all of us. Let's continue.